Welcome to the PKK Peace Panel. My name is Anna Gawel. I'm the managing editor of the Washington Diplomat newspaper here in D.C. I was actually just in Istanbul 2 weeks ago. It was my very first trip to the country, and we did get caught up a bit in the protests. We were, in fact, in the Marmara Hotel, which overlooks Gezi Park, right when some of the initial clashes broke out. And interestingly enough, we had just finished an hour-long meeting with an expert discussing the Kurdish issue. When we stepped out of the meeting, lo and behold, there was tear gas, water cannons, and everything else that you're familiar with now. But I think I mention this story because I think it's a good example of how the protests have really overshadowed what could potentially be a historic breakthrough in a nearly 30-year conflict. As many of you know, since 1984, more than 40,000 people have died in the guerrilla war between the government and Kurdish separatists who are seeking greater autonomy and rights for Turkey's sizable ethnic Kurdish population, which numbers about 15 million. In terms of peace initiatives and ceasefires, we've certainly been here before, only to see them collapse. But there really does seem to be some significant momentum right now. In March, the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, began talks with the imprisoned Kurdish leader, Abdullah Öcalan, who's been in prison for 14 years now. And then shortly afterward, in May, the PKK began to withdraw from Turkish territory. So we have a ceasefire, but of course it's very fragile. There are no doubt spoilers on both sides who would like to derail the peace talks. And now both sides are really getting into some of the thorny issues that have derailed previous talks. Among them, disarmament and reintegration, what to do with Kurdish prisoners, including Öcalan himself. Of course, the longstanding issue of teaching the Kurdish language in Turkish schools. But above all, it's going to be all about amending or possibly scrapping the Constitution to give Kurds greater political rights. All of these issues in and of themselves are challenging enough, but they are taking place against a backdrop of domestic political turmoil and, not to mention, Syria's civil war next door. So we're going to discuss and break down all of these developments with our panel, which I'd like to introduce now. First, we have Aliza Marcus, who's formerly an international correspondent for the Boston Globe. She's covered the PKK for more than 8 years for the Christian Science Monitor and later as a staff writer for Reuters. And she's the author of Blood and Belief, the PKK, and the Kurdish Fight for Independence. We also have Ayse Çelik, who is an associate professor at Sabanci University in Istanbul, where she teaches political science and conflict resolution. And she has also written several articles and edited a book on the Kurdish question, forced Kurdish migration, as well as the role of NGOs in the conflict. And finally, we have Christopher Harmon, who is the Major General Matthew C. Horner Chair of Military Theory at Marine Corps University. He specializes in the nature of war, terrorism and counterterrorism, international relations, and U.S. foreign policy. And before his current position, he was the curricula director in the Program for Terrorism and Security Studies at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies in Germany. So each panelist will talk for about 10 minutes, and then we will open the floor up for a Q&A. So, Aliza, if you could get us started. Sure. Yeah.
Hi. Very happy to be here. What I plan to talk about is the BDP's role in the peace process and look at the effects of withdrawal and ultimately disarmament on the Kurdish national movement inside Turkey, which currently is PKK dominated. And I want to end with some comments on some of what the Deputy Prime Minister said as relates to the Kurdish issue and democratization. But I think first it's helpful to really look at the Gezi protest, the protest in Istanbul, and the role that BDP played, or in this case really didn't play, in the protests, and what that means about the Kurdish question and solution. The BDP wasn't involved as an organization. You did have two very prominent deputies, Sira Önder and Ertuğrul Kürkçü, who were there, especially Sira Önder was there from the beginning, and to a certain extent Sabahat Tuncel, who is a Kurdish deputy. But the first two are Turks. They're leftists. They have a long history of involvement in leftist affairs, and obviously Ertuğrul Kürkçü had been a big, one of the leaders of the student left movement. But as an organization, BDP stayed aside, and that happens despite the fact that their rhetoric has always been one of working with the Turkish left, of sort of leading the opposition, of leading a big change democracy for everybody. So why didn't they take part? One, I think their rhetoric of the Turkish left really just is, it's a rhetoric. It's not something, I mean, they form alliances with leftists when they can. In theory, yes, they are obviously working towards democracy for everybody, but the fact is they didn't see this protest movement as something that would work towards or lead to some gains for Kurds. They were very concerned about some of the Turkish nationalist rhetoric coming out of that, some of the signs and people who were speaking. And to the extent that CHP may have thought of playing a role, CHP is completely on the outs with BDP. I mean, the things that CHP says does not make them into a favorite of Kurds. So they stayed on the sidelines. They also saw, I think, to a certain extent, the protests as somewhat parochial. It wasn't that they weren't sympathetic to this, not at all. They were very sympathetic. But at the same time that people were complaining about police brutality, authoritarianism, and so on, these are things that Kurds have lived for 20, 30 years on a much higher level. And I think for the Kurdish voters for BDP, they looked at these protests, and I know as I was in contact with numerous contacts of mine in the Southeast during this, they looked at these protests as, yes, something good, but not something that really reflected their own condition or talked to their own demands. Just is something that's a sign of this. During that last week, actually during this week, while the protests were underway, a Turkish court turned down a request to hear civilian complaints on the Uludere massacre, which was the killing of 34 civilians last year. The KCK trial in Diyarbakir, in which you have 175 people, human rights activists, lawyers, journalists, BDP politicians, parliamentarians on trial, of whom 95 or 98 have been in prison for 3 years, leaving behind families, children, jobs. This trial was underway as well. So Kurds, had something else that they were looking at, and I think what you see from this is sort of two separate narratives developing inside Turkey, which I think points to a growing separation in some ways of the interests and battles for Kurds and Turks, which can have repercussions on what sort of how the peace process plays out. So I think for some Turks, Turkish leftists, this was a shock. A friend of mine in the Turkish parliament actually said to me, well, the BDP has always spoken about fighting for all of Turks, everybody in Turkey, and now we see that isn't happening. That they only care about their own fight. And the answer is yes, to a certain extent, they do. It's true that a democratic Turkey will offer more stability and more rights for everybody, not just Turks, but Kurds as well. But Kurds increasingly can look across the border into Iraqi Kurdistan and see a situation where the Iraqi Kurds have managed to gain what they wanted, while Iraq does not represent the stable democratic system that everyone had hoped it would be. So there is something that Kurds are increasingly, I think, looking very much at their interests. And the fact is they didn't want to undermine the peace process with Erdogan. And they knew that if they had taken part in an organized fashion in Istanbul, that would have risked Erdogan's wrath. Now, are they right to trust in Erdogan? Yes or no? Well, Erdogan has... He has moved forward. The Deputy Prime Minister spoke about a lot of steps that the government is taking and in the process in taking. But Erdogan himself and AKP has really tried to isolate the BDP and keep them outside of this process. So to the extent that the BDP is hoping to be a main player, they're facing opposition from Erdogan, who has tried to work directly with Abdullah Öcalan and keep other players outside. That's because I believe the Turkish government wants to see this solely as a military problem still. They do talk about making democratic changes, and the Deputy Prime Minister did speak to some of that, but the fact is they see that as changes that they will decide, that they will make, that will come on Turkey's terms, not necessarily changes that will be negotiated with BDP or with the PKK. So they're trying to, I believe Turkey's trying to maintain control of this by isolating BDP, but it hasn't worked. There really are three players in this, and the reason it hasn't worked is that Turkey, first of all, needed BDP to be like a postman. They're the ones who pass the messages between Öcalan and Kandil. And in the process, this has given BDP more of a forum for speaking out and for playing a role, both in its discussions with Öcalan and then discussions that the committees have later on in Kandil. And they do this despite the fact that AKP tries to decide who actually gets to go see Öcalan. They're constantly deciding who can make up the committee members. They have refused to give BDP a full role in any of the political changes underway in Ankara right now. BDP people constantly complain of being sidelined. I think this really is to the detriment of everybody because BDP is a legitimate player. It has experience on the ground. It's not an armed movement. It understands what people want in a way that's different from the military leadership, and certainly in a way that's different from Öcalan, who's been in prison now for over 10 years, and even before that wasn't well known for, shall we say, listening to people very closely. The fact is that Öcalan also has limited control over Kandil. Öcalan and Kandil are in a certain balance. They both understand that they need each other, but they have to give each other room to operate. The real power of the PKK obviously lies in Kandil. That's where the weapons are. That's where the fighters are. Those are the people who can disrupt at any moment the peace process. And they need to be, their views need to be considered as well. Again, AKP has been a little bit hesitant to draw them in directly. But for both Öcalan and Kandil, I feel that they're giving the BDP some more room to maneuver because they understand that BDP represents their prestige on the ground. For Öcalan, BDP is his interlocutor. And for Kandil, the PKK, BDP is the group that will later on absorb the fighters. Should they be allowed to return to disarm and return to Turkey, they will want to join a political party. So it's important to keep BDP as a strong party and as a strong player in this. But I feel, and I have argued this before, that Turkey is missing an opportunity by isolating BDP. And from my talks with BDP members, I can say they do want to play a more active role, and it's important because they are in some ways the most pragmatic on the ground. They understand what Kurds, the daily needs of Kurds. And if you want to negotiate a full solution, this isn't just about a military battle. It's about how Kurds lead their daily lives. So where is the peace process now? I would say despite the Deputy Prime Minister's rather optimistic outlook, I'd say it's filled with a lot of dismay and frustration on the Kurdish side. The PKK certainly won't break talks. They're not going to be the one to do this. But nor will they disarm without a full solution, a full package out there. What are some of the frustrations and dismay on the Kurdish side? Well, the constitutional changes have stalled. The Turkish army is building new fortifications on the border. The AKP government won't lay out an actual plan. They won't say where they want this to go. There's a lot of talk of we want to disarm the terrorists, but less talk of what we want to do for the Kurds. But at the same time, I think it would be wrong to see the PKK's withdrawal as leading to any sort of vacuum, any sort of weakening of the PKK. And sometimes I fear the Turkish government may ignore this. They're leaving behind very strong civilian structures that they created over the past 10 years, sometimes under the phrase of KCK. So they have BDP, which, while formally independent of the PKK, obviously operates within its circle of influence very strongly. They have a lot of civil groups that the PKK created or encouraged the creation of over the past decade to establish a stronger hold in southeast Turkey. And they have the KCK commissars. And some of the people who have been arrested, and most of them are probably innocent, but there are some people who actually have been directly a conduit between the PKK and civilian authorities. But as quickly as they're arrested, new ones are coming in. So there's absolutely no vacuum there. So where does this leave the PKK right now? PKK remains in an incredibly strong position, not only because of its civilian structures inside Turkey, but the fact is it's maintained its weapons. It has excellent relations now, or fairly good relations, with the Iraqi Kurds, and it's doing very well in Syria, where its affiliate organization, YPG, basically controls much of the Kurdish region. So the PKK has withdrawn with its prestige, with its weapons, and with its supporters intact, which means that Turkey needs to, or should, for a better solution, actually recognize that the PKK remains a player and needs to be dealt with not just through an imprisoned leader. It's true that there are some other groups starting to rise. Starting now that the PKK is withdrawn, you have different Kurdish groups outside the PKK's influence that have had meetings. I don't know how many of you have heard of DDKD, but they're an old group from the 70s. They just had a conference, I think probably about, but very few people, about 15 or 20. KDP is going to be holding, the Turkish wing is going to be holding a conference this summer. But none of this should be taken as a sign of PKK's weakness. These are small groups without much influence. And for now, the PKK remains the dominant power, and one that Turkey, for all its attempts to work around this and just deal with an imprisoned leader, is, I think, needs to recognize this. So, where will I think what will happen next? I think there's two possibilities. Erdogan could take advantage of what's just happened in Istanbul and sort of show his new democratic street credentials, as it were, by reaching out and making some overtures to the Kurds and taking actual concrete steps, potentially on the peace process. Or he could be concerned about more opposition, about weaknesses in his own party, and he could step back and continue to focus on unilateral moves that don't necessarily answer Kurdish demands. I don't think that Turkey should wait very long. I think the PKK, is, like I said, is not going to be the one to break this, but I don't know how long their patience can last on this. There's just two things I want to say about the deputy prime ministers. It was a very nice speech. Some of what he said was correct. But there are 2 points. One, when he said that the AKP is the most popular in southeast Turkey, that's only if you look at their votes based on national elections, which for a variety of reasons aren't really representative of the Kurdish party's support. You really need to look at local elections, and there the BDP essentially controls most of the southeast. So it's not true that AKP gets the most votes by that count. And certainly on the issue of the fourth, the judicial package and democratization and allowing freedom of expression, that would be true if the KCK trials weren't underway, if people weren't receiving 20-year sentences for standing up and giving speeches during political rallies, if you didn't have journalists in prison. So whatever changes have come through the package, they have not yet trickled down to the actual people affected by these laws, and that's a huge weakness in Turkey's democratization. So thank you very much.
Hi. First of all, sorry for my sore throat. I got it on the plane from the Ayse, and that's why I have to speak this way. I would like to start by saying that, like many others in Turkey, I feel concerned about the recent events in my country and keep the hope that peace we will witness peace soon. As you all know, the peace process and negotiations are now overshadowed with what's happening in Turkey following the Gazi Park protests. In my talk, I will first specifically discuss how the negotiations are perceived at the societal level, but also argue that we are in a completely new phase whose outcome will shape the peace process. When I used to describe the Kurdish issue, I used to identify 3 fault lines. The first one is that at one level, the conflict is between the Turkish state and an ethnic minority, which is the Kurds, and there the conflict focuses mostly on the issue of culture and political rights. At the second level, the conflict is between the Turkish state and an insurgent group, the PKK, and at this level, the issues are about DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, but also about how to confront the violent past. On a third level, which was rather less talked about, there is a conflict in the form of social tensions between Turks and Kurds, especially in bigger cities in Western Turkey, which received high numbers of internal displaced Kurds. Over the past few months, this level of group relations also got interlinked to the other intergroup relations that I will talk about. Through the peace process and constitution-making process, we now also have a problem of redefinition of citizenship and reconstruction of us. As I will explain later, these are both relational and structural processes which are interlinked. Through the Kurdish issue, there emerge various issues of democratic governance, intergroup relations, and democratic expressions of identities. These require not only democratization of various institutions and governance, but also thinking of new ways of state citizens and intergroup relations. Thus, structural aspects of the Kurdish issue should not be thought of independently from these relational aspects. As the Deputy Minister also talked about, in an effort to increase the public support for the peace process, the government formed what is known as the Vice People Committees to serve in the 7 regions official regions of the country. Although some criticisms were directed to the people who were chosen and the idea itself, the members of the committees, mostly from the media, academia, and the civil society, were very important in listening to the demands of the, I would say, the ordinary people and explaining the need for such a peace process. Our meetings as the academicians for peace with some of the members of these committees revealed some important findings. First of all, these committees, for the first time, facilitated a channel to discuss people's beliefs, fears, needs, and for the first time, people felt like they're being listened to on this subject, which has increased the support for the peace process. Yet at the same time, the wise people detected the existence of polarized language among the society. Usages of such words like terrorist versus guerrilla or our leader Öcalan in reference to the PKK and its leader present this polarization. Thirdly, especially certain regions of Turkey have no idea what Kurds have been through. This results from learning about the Kurdish issue from the mainstream media representation. This is an important social barrier for the continuation of the process and signals the need to bring different groups in touch with each other and inform them in the correct way about the history of the conflict as well as the Kurdish demands. Those who came to these meetings argue against the wise people and the peace process mostly use the same old cliches, such as defining the Kurdish issue as manipulation of foreign powers, reflecting the fear of being divided. And this usually came from what also the Deputy Minister called ulusalcı. I don't know what exactly would translate to, and I would, in a nutshell, say Kemalist nationalist. Who was mostly represented by some leftist groups, Workers' Party, which has nothing to do with workers, and some of the CHP members, and also because they opposed because also they thought that this process would lead to authoritarianism through adopting presidential system. According to Konda, a public opinion firm who surveyed the public opinion about the negotiations since the public announcement of the talks between the PKK, Öcalan, and the government, over the 5 months, there has been a steady increase in the societal support for peace. Since January, they asked the following question to a randomized sample of people. What do you think about the peace process, which started the BT MP's visit to Öcalan? Those who believe that this process is an important contribution to the overall peace process increased from 38% to 53%. Similarly, from January to May, the number of those who thought that these talks should be seen as the failure of the Turkish state dropped from 52% to 41%, and decided people reducing from 10% to 6%. Interestingly, while the Kurdish population support stayed steadily high, the Turkish population support increased from 31% to 36%, and the biggest change, it seems, came from the AKP voters, support jumping from 48% to 74%. However, one should not neglect the increasing support coming from the non-partisans and the undecided. The percentage of support of these two categories rose from 27 to 39% and from 13 to 46 respectively. What all this show is that there was a slow but increasing support for the talks, thus the wise people did a very important job in trying to create the societal support for peace. However, peace processes are complex, multidimensional, and should include various issues and various actors. Negotiations are only one aspect of the process. As I said earlier, they need to be analyzed and incorporated into the discussions of rethinking who we are, how to respect needs and expressions of various identity groups in Turkey as democratization of politics. Studies in Turkey and the results of the city visits of the wise people show that when you ask the question of whether one wants peace as a broad question, most people say yes. But what is more important is what people understand from the word peace itself. It is important that the peace process should be furthered by democratizing the institutions, such as changing laws, rewriting the constitutions. But unless the society finds means to communicate their different expectations from an understanding of peace, the peace process cannot continue. In this respect, what will come out from the Gezi Park protests are utmost important. The park itself showed that we are witnessing the emergence of new forms of politics and expression. I wouldn't say representation, because studies show that these youth especially do not want to believe in forming another political party, but rather continue this through civic involvement. This requires understanding the dynamics of the movement itself. Contrary to what is believed here in the US, it's not a secular versus Islamic clash. It is the clash of old politics versus new politics in Turkey. The old politics, which almost all the political parties adopt in Turkey, is driven by fears and rests on the otherization discourses. This has historically been the case in Turkey. Whether the fears of the secularists, Islamists, nationalists, and many others are well-grounded or not, is completely a different question. What I'm arguing is that making politics based on fears and continuing the language of otherization misses an important part of the picture. That picture, which was facilitated by many women, youth, and environmentalist groups who oppose any form of authoritarianism, be it in the form of patriarchy, militarism, government repression, or any other, has the potential to create the empathy needed for the peace process. In one of the academic gatherings we had in the park with the university students, a female student explained how she, for the first time in her life, approached her own other, the Ulusalcı, who were shouting militarist slogans. She described this experience as a total new learning and feeling for herself, a channel to be able to speak with one's other. Of course, it doesn't mean that she changed her mind, but caught clues about how to see differences. The fact that these youth cared more about individual freedoms and were mostly not affiliated with traditional political parties, which was, we know this from the results of several studies made in the park, made this possible. At an institutional level, the informal agreement between the Ulusalcıs and the Kurdish nationalists that they would not attack each other can also be taken as a signal for the emergence of this new form of politics. At one level, this picture emerged from the relatively calm, non-violent atmosphere following the peace process itself. So the peace process itself facilitated this environment. On another level, it has the potential to further it and open up the channels for a qualitative contact between various clashing views, including those about the Kurdish issue. This new form of politics has the potential to transform the old understanding of we are all the same regardless of our differences to one which says we are together with our differences. If this is respected and understood, it will help the peace process itself. If it's reacted from a conspiracy theorist perspective and analyzed with fears enhanced by the old politics understanding by all the actors, it carries the risk of endangering the peace process itself. We all know that the road to peace is a process and thus can be spoiled at various levels. by many actors. At these times, if the government approaches it from this old perspective, the process would fail anyways. Problems cannot be solved with the same thinking that created them. On another note, Gezi protests show that the average Turk realized how media could be deceiving and be manipulated when they themselves were heard but not heard. This experience taught them that Kurd stories could also be hidden or distorted. I heard many first-hand stories that Turks started saying sorry for being deaf or believing the media representation of the Kurdish issue. Of course, this might be overread, or we also believe that the Ulusalcıs are trying to take over too, but at least this first time opening up is an important important signal. In sum, to answer the question asked by this panel, is a Turkey-PKK peace finally possible? I would say first that the answer cannot be thought of independently from what will emerge from the Gezi protests. Two, that the process is not and should not be only about the talks between the government and the PKK, but should expand to various strata of the society. Third, in doing so, of course, there is also a need to continue democratizing politics, such as changing the Prevention of Terrorism Act, especially Articles 8 and 9, to open up the space for a fruitful dialogue, which should be enhanced by creating a language that would not utter and adopt the language of the old politics. Thank you.
If the chair allows, I'll take my 10 minutes here in this spot. Thank you. I speak today as an independent scholar who works for the Marine Corps University, and as you might have guessed, don't in any way speak for the government or the Marine Corps. I think what I can help with today is perhaps in a room full of regional and country experts to maybe add a bit of perspective from some of the other sub-state actors and insurgents that I've looked at. And initially, I would say I'm quite struck by how unusual it is to see a current discussion going on between an executive on one hand, the executive of a sovereign country, and on the other hand, a dialogue with an insurgent who is literally negotiating from jail and communicating with his organization there. That's a most unusual thing. But, you know, PKK is an extremely unusual organization. It starts with the founding by a fellow who's saying that he's a Marxist-Leninist, and those kinds of principles are confirmed as late as the 1995 Party Congress, and yet they also say they're nationalist, and we naturally accept them as a nationalist entity. Not surprising. It's an extremely unusual organization in other ways, like the fact that it is basically was effectively decapitated in 1999, and more than a few people, including myself, saw it as defeated, including one of my favorite scholars on these issues. And the word defeated was rather common, but remarkably then, after 5 years, we see a kind of resurgence, a kind of a phoenix-like reappearance. That leaves us with a mix of feelings, including the fact that the peace process is, as someone just said, something we've been through before with this organization. So it's an extremely unusual situation that we're in and are compelled to think through. I judge that PKK is engaged in a classic kind of version of fight and talk strategy. Governments will do this and sub-state actors as well. They're pushing forward now and with some interesting prospects, because it seems that Erdogan seems favorable to this. It seems that many Turks are favorable indeed. And very important to all this, it seems that the Barzani government in northern Iraq is interested and favorable. The prospect for getting a kind of sanctuary, even temporary, is always very enticing, and they both have one and need one and have lost one in Syria in the past. It's an extremely intriguing thing for the president, or the Prime Minister of the Republic, because Right now, it seems that his margin in Parliament is just a little slender, and the prospect of doing something this favorable and something this helpful as achieving peace, if he could do that, would be an immensely strengthening thing. Well, this problem is in many ways unique and intriguing. It also causes us to reflect on some other dimensions of these kinds of conflicts. We have, on the cheery side, a certain number of successes that we can look to. Someone earlier today mentioned IRA. There's the remarkable story of Renamo in Mozambique. There is at least one story of success, maybe two, with autonomous zones in the Philippines. And so we can think that there is prospects, and these are good. We also know many cases where long, elaborate talks utterly failed, as in Sri Lanka. It seems there's three special problems, as I see it, and one is politics and its objectives. Sometimes actors in politics have what we could call unlimited objectives, or they're barely limited. And in this case, if we think about, for example, Taliban, we're hoping now, desperately hoping, that we might entice them to the table in the next year to take a role at the table. I would suspect that Taliban, in fact, isn't so much in seeking a place at the table as a chance to govern Afghanistan as it did earlier in all but about 5 or 6% of it. That's a party we have to judge as not aspiring so much to democracy, probably, but as to political power. So in the present case, I think we're all interested in cultural rights for the Kurds, opening to more political parties, and even further dimensions and developments, I suppose. But we do have to ask ourselves, too, is it true that they've set aside the larger dream for either total autonomy or, in fact, what it always was before, not only autonomy, but a separate land which includes swaths of various neighboring countries? Where do we stand? Has PKK abandoned really its larger plans? Do we know? The second interesting thing is the character of the leadership. Now, when we study an actor or a group of this sort, we look for prospects for engaging in politics and engaging in democracy if that's what we as Democrats want. And if that's what we hope for Turkey. And sometimes we see those in some very serious fighting organizations, like the Algerian FLN was always intriguing, because even though there were some highly fierce people or strong-minded people, they were somewhat offset in a kind of group party leadership, a kind of group leadership. It was not possible really to decapitate such an organization, because there were many strong leaders who were capable, and at least gave us some sense that in the emergence after 1962, there might be someone who could understand the balancing of a true parliament, or the way democracy might work. And on the other hand, there are personalities in the fighting undergrounds like Abimael Guzman, who had a very large organization, but was absolutely not democratic, and no one thinks so, especially Mr. Guzman himself. And so we have to ask ourselves on the pole of things here, what kind of leadership prospects have we in the present organization? The last of the three is disarmament. Again, intriguing, problematic. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes not. In the case of the Salvadoran guerrillas, there was a remarkable UN intervention, a peace process which seemed very promising, and which formal written commitments were made to disarm. And then again, about a year later, after Chapultepec, it was found that there was a cache that had not been found, and then, well, sure enough, there was 100 more arms caches. So in the case of the PKK, we take note, as the first speaker did, that they retain their weapons and seem to be retaining them as they cross over down into Iraq. So can it work? I think the process is challenging to estimate. I think immediate current events we're all watching in the newspapers almost speak against a real settlement, because they do seem to weaken Mr. Erdogan. They do seem to, we seem the PKK throwing in its support for the demonstrations in the street, at least officially. It is possible that such things will bring out Turkish nationalism, which may weigh against some creative and interesting settlement with the Kurds. That's possible. Nonetheless, the Turkish government is pursuing it very strongly, and I think as they do, I think the prospects will get pretty interesting. Will they be able to see their way around this demand for releasing Öcalan from prison? He is incendiary to many people. It may be that in terms of preparing for a democratic process, they simply won't be able, in the end, to come to such a decision, and that won't be shocking, really. And neither do we need to see that, if it happens that way, as a negative, and neither is my statement intended to be at all incendiary itself. The problem is to bring up Kurdish political figures, some known perhaps, many not yet known, who can take a place in the future of the new Turkey and in leading Kurdish forces within Turkey. In short, we're not here today to elevate the PKK. We are here because we're interested in the Kurds and the Turks. I think for its part, Turkey now will have to be remarkably careful and attentive to language of the new constitution in trying to make sure that absolutely nothing gets in which can be seen as too racially minded or in any way too exclusive. That will be a challenge they'll have to take. But in the balance with that, Kurdish politicians may have to consider that they won't be able to see their party, be it the PKK or something brand new, like I might like to see, they won't be able to see them as being the, quote, sole legitimate representative of the Kurdish people. It's a phrase we've heard before. I'm not sure that in a democratic context they want to make such a claim or have a right to it. So in the end, I think so often we tend to frame the question in terms of, do we say yes or no to the PKK? I think Ankara should say yes to the Kurdish people and to the Turkish people, and probably say less and less about those in the PKK hierarchy at present. Because I think in the end what we're interested in here as friendly outsiders, most of us are, is about the health and the security of a great polity and a great country and all of those within it. And the objective is for peace and justice for Kurds and Turks alike, and that's immensely different than satisfying the interests of the PKK. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for the insightful remarks. I'd like to go ahead and throw out the first question, but in the meantime, we have microphones on either side. So if you'd like to line up, we'd be happy to take as many questions as we can. You each obviously touched on the protest, but I'd like to delve into their aftermath a bit more. And Aliza, you talked about that Erdogan could possibly seize the moment, seize the PKK talks to regain some legitimacy, cement his legacy. Or on the flip side, he might be too politically weakened to push through some of these changes that are no doubt going to face fierce backlash. I'm wondering if you could each talk about which way do you think the Prime Minister will lean, and on a related note, if he does decide to push through some of these more bolder proposals, what he could do to lay the groundwork among the public, which will remain very skeptical. If each of you could briefly address the topic. Whoever would like to start.
No, please.
I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer.
Yeah, it's a real. I think it's a really tough question, and I think this is something only the Prime Minister can answer, and maybe some of his advisors. I can just say that I think he's shown himself to be a very strong and capable leader when he wants to be, and somebody who's not necessarily afraid of negative press. Not all the time, as we saw over the past 2 weeks. So this is really a question of how he wants to play out the next year or so before elections for the presidency. And I think he has an amazing opportunity, and hopefully he'll grab it. That's.
Do you think among the public, and Ayse, you talked briefly about some of the polls, that there's an increasing level of support. Do you think that the protests, almost with the turmoil taking place, that people will not want to engage in something as controversial as a potential breakthrough with the PKK? Or on the flip side, is this the moment?
Well, the Gezi protests are very new, and sociologists are still gathering data to understand the protest. And also the protest itself in the park is different than what is outside it. You know, the deputy minister talked about illegal groupings. They were outside, and they came later. So how much of it is reflected? How much it reflects the society is still questionable. But I think AKP is still the strongest party because this youth still they oppose all old political parties, but yet they are not for the establishment of a new political system. So I don't think we will see the effect of Gezi protests in the short term, probably in the long term. So if we were to, I believe, of course, but I'm a social scientist, I should not be talking on these terms, but the surveys show this still is the first party.
Great. Well, we'll go ahead and take 2 questions at a time. If you could briefly introduce yourself, and please.
I am Dr. Nisar Chaudhry, analyst on South Asia. It is wonderful to listen to such enlightened panelists who rolled out a wonderful and expanded picture about what is happening in Turkey. Every system has its merits and demerits, and democracy is not a product, it's a process. US, it took centuries to reach to this point. And generally, in most of the countries, the democratic process, the problems of democracy are resolved by becoming more democratic. In case of Turkey, was emerging virtually as a leader to diffuse situations in other countries and resolve conflicts in other countries. And now they are dealing with their own domestic challenges and the challenges in their own neighborhood. This situation that has developed in Turkey, how it would affect and can it affect civil-military relations, and how vulnerable the democracy can be if this is not stopped, these things are not stopped in their tracks. Thank you.
Okay. So I think talking about some of the difficulties of developing a democracy and civil-military relations, and also how these the current situation domestically might impact Turkey's ability to be a player in the region. And let's take one more, and we'll condense some of that.
My name is Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst. It is easy to suppose that Ayatollah Sistani next door has been the source of moderation on revenge attacks by the Shia, and that a post-Sistani regime might result in tremendous violence once again in Iraq. At that point, the Kurds are going to go, to heck with this. This is not our fight. We are finally out of here. This is our last chance in human history to get the hell out of here and establish our own entity. They can make some promises to Turkey. We won't take any Turkish territory. We will welcome Kurds who want to move to Kurdish administration, and we will protect the Turkmen in northern Iraq. Ms. Marcus, can you imagine any situation in which Kurdistan finally gets to re-exist and Turkish tanks don't go rolling into Erbil?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think that first of all, Turkey is tying itself to the KRG, as we know, through all the various oil deals, and there's a lot of money to be lost there if something goes wrong. Barzani himself has made somewhat clear that he's not interested in being a leader of all Kurds. So while I agree with your analysis that the Kurds in Iraq could certainly split off, I don't know to what extent that would change the dynamics for Turkey right now. I think Turkey has made that mental break at this point. That red line that was never going to be crossed has been crossed so many times they don't even know where it is anymore. Their attention has somewhat switched to the threat from the Kurds in Syria instead of the Kurds from Iraq. They feel they have that situation under control. So I don't see this expanding a Kurdistan, the greater Kurdistan, so much as really giving more psychological impetus and strength to the PKK and to their Kurdish supporters, and certainly likewise on the Syrian side. So I don't think Turkish tanks will cross over because they'd end up running across pipelines and things like that and hurting too many people, too many of their own people right now.
And if we could talk a little bit about how the domestic situation will impact Turkey's regional weight. Anybody, Chris, perhaps?
Well, I want to agree with Aliza Marcus in terms of civil-military relations now. I'm encouraged in the sense that when we've seen coups in the past, 71, 80, we've seen these often as responses to tremendous levels of violence which threaten the society generally. Sometimes a society will surprise us in the way that Italy did me in the 1970s when there was a staggering level of terrorism and the military never moved. So they have moved sometimes in Turkey in the far past. They have moved in some of our Latin American countries. But right now we don't have that level of violence. And in fact, I think right now there's a sort of optimism about the prospects for progress. And the military also, quite frankly, has taken a few hard hits from the current administration and is somewhat checked as to its power. So if it were to move, that would be a surprising and rather probably ill-thought move. So I don't really expect it. And I think what's happening now seems to be a simmer, and it's of concern, but that's okay. And democracies often work like this. And I don't fear right now for any kind of precipitate action by the military.
I agree. One of the biggest success of the AKP government was to demilitarize the politics, and during the Gezi protests there were some groups who called for the intervention of military. We know that, but they've been suppressed by the more democratic groups, especially the women groups were very much against the militaristic slogans and the call for military to intervene.
My name is İhsan Gündüz. I'm a graduate student at George Mason School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And my question to Professor Çelik, you mentioned the Turkish government not only should talk to PKK, but also should include other actors. And we know you teach conflict resolution classes in Turkey. And do you think that the government is going to include other actors from the Turkish side to this process, and what other actors can be?
Should I answer?
Yeah.
I didn't mean to say it should include it to the negotiation process. I meant to say the government should include all the actors to the broader peace process, which is talk to them on various levels about the intergroup relations that I talked about. Following, for example, 2 weeks ago there was a conference called Democracy and Peace, which brought together different identity groups in Turkey, and they talked about the Kurdish issue, and they started talking about how these groups should start talking about the injustices they have done to each other. Of course, the Kurdish issue should be dealt specifically in its own parameters. The confrontation of the past, such as the injustices done by the village guards, so on and so forth. It has its own specific nature, but it's also interlinked to other problems of the Alevis face, the Armenians face, so on and so forth. So what I'm saying is that at one level, as we further, it should be linked to other issues that we had in the past.
Next question.
Thank you. Jeff Steinberg with EIR. My question's provoked by some of the comments by Dr. Harmon, but I'd be interested in hearing from all three of the speakers. A number of the insurgency organizations that Dr. Harmon referenced, I'm thinking specifically about the FARC and the Taliban, have gone through a kind of a significant evolution over the course of these insurgencies, and at a certain point it becomes hard to differentiate between insurgent movements and organized crime syndicates, particularly involvement in very lucrative international trafficking in drugs and weapons. And I'd like to get a sense of where the PKK, what's your assessments of the PKK as it has evolved over the time of this long struggle, and to what extent these alternative senses of identity and criminalization can impact on this whole negotiating process.
Yes, Mr. Steinberg, although I didn't mention FARC, I know why you did and why you've paired them with Taliban. Both of them by very credible sources like Jane's Intelligence Review in the case of FARC, and Gretchen Peters, whose second edition of the book The Seeds of Terror is one that's very good and I use in classes. Both of them probably have been making, at their high points at least, as much as $500 million, billion with a B, in drug money. FARC's may have declined because FARC has declined simply, but Taliban's hasn't. And I think the real answer to the question is what it gives an insurgency is a tremendous longevity and independence. And so that if they were to have a quarrel with ISI for a few months, Taliban could continue to be sure that it has a very good source of income. Moreover, this is a particular kind of capital that you can bury and leave in the ground for a long time when it's a case of refined opium, and it's just as good in a year or two later. Therefore, they're given, it is a rather special category then. We think of them in terms of leaders, we think of them in terms of popular support, we think of the questions of justice, but in terms of logistics, we also have to consider their power in that respect. And when they have that kind of money, it does tend to make them very independent actors.
Actually, I'd like to talk about that for a second, because I actually did a lot of research in that area, because that's one of the big areas where the Turkish government has often claimed that the PKK is really just a crime syndicate. And I've spoken with groups and intelligence services in Europe, and with PKK members and others, and Kurds and so on. And I would say that it's completely incorrect to link them with these other crime syndicates. That's not. That hasn't been the direction of the PKK. There's no question that they've gotten some money from drugs. I mean, there's been a lot of major drug dealers in Turkey who were Kurds and who gave money to the PKK. There's been independent PKK members. I know some cases in Europe who have, traded in drugs and donated that money. The PKK doesn't really look where the money comes from, but although they've had a lot of opportunities, especially when they were based in the Bekaa Valley, to get more involved in the drug trade, they didn't. They've stayed very focused. I mean, it's a little bit of their Marxist approach, I think, which has kept them much less susceptible to stealing this money and saving. I mean, Öcalan famously, when he was kicked out of Syria, announced that he had something like $100,000, but he didn't even know where it was. I mean, they weren't, we weren't talking about big Swiss bank accounts or anything like that. They've always run a very cheap guerrilla campaign that's relied a lot on support from the local people, where they are incredibly popular. And for money, they get a lot from taxing the smuggling trade, which in that sense has been no different than what the Iraqi Kurds or anybody else on that border has done. So I wouldn't put them in the same category at all.
Let's go ahead and take the last two questions.
Dakhil Shamo, Voice of America, the Kurdish Service. I would like to ask Professor Çelik about to what extent the Turkish government is serious in its talks with the PKK, because we know that the PKK, from its sides, that withdraw from Turkey to northern Iraq. So what are the steps that AK Party took, or what step that it will take, so people can believe that AK Party is serious in solving the Kurdish problem in Turkey?
Okay, and one more.
Niklas Anzinger from the American Enterprise Institute. I wanted to ask almost the same question. Isn't this peace process ultimately a question of genuity? I recently talked to some representatives of the BDP, and as Aliza correctly observed, Erdogan chose Öcalan to make him the strong man in this negotiation process, as of kind of a strategy pointing at alienating the BDP. So doesn't this point in a different direction than like assuming that Erdogan is genuine about Kurdish demands for integration and for broader rights?
Say, Aliza, would you like to start? Or?
First of all, let me state by saying that I don't work more at the track one level, but more on the societal level. But to answer your question, I think the problem at the moment is not necessarily about genuinity, but more about how the two sides see about the process itself. For the AKP, it ends with the withdrawal, and the deputy minister also said that after that it's all about democratization. Whereas for the Kurds, it starts with the withdrawal of the PKK. Therefore, the next step is to see the moves by the government and keep continuing the talks. So it's about one sees it as the start, one sees it at the end, and I think that's the most important question than the genuinity itself.
Eliza?
Yeah, no, I agree completely with that, and I think it's very important that how the AKP still seems to view this process as something where they can decide, they can make the decisions of what Kurds want, they can decide what they'll give Kurds and what will satisfy them, and Kurds really see themselves as being now a partner to this, and their demands have changed over the decades, as one can expect. So to that extent, I think that the focus on Öcalan has been a lack of willingness yet on the AKP side to see this as a real political process and to recognize that the Kurds have a political actor which is both somewhat separate from and very closely linked to the PKK. In that sense, it can operate similar to Sinn Féin and the IRA, but they don't seem ready to recognize that. So I think they're genuine. They do want to solve this. They would, they have made some changes that are important, but they have yet to see this as the real political issue, which is what needs to be done to solve it.
And Chris, any thoughts? No, thank you. Okay. And one more question.
Is Jihad Saleh. I'm Kurdish journalist and researcher from Syria. My questions, about Syrian revolution and the Turkish role of Free Syria Army and Kurdish issues in Syria. The first questions, how is we can make a successful process of peace between PKK and Turkish government if still Erdogan government describe PKK they are terrorists? And also, what do you think is exactly will be successful this process when we see challenge between PKK and Turkish government around Syrian revolution? Second questions, the Turkish government have bad rule of Kurdish issues in Syria since 1 year to right now, when some jihadist or group of Islamic of Syrian or mixing, they sent to Syria to fighting with Kurdish community. For example, Ras Lain, when they're fighting with the YPG and some Kurdish rebels. Thank you.
So I think, how can Erdogan negotiate when he still considers the PKK, along with the US and EU, a terrorist organization, and then to discuss Syria's role and how that might impact the negotiations. Chris?
I'll start and be brief and turn it over to my colleagues. The terrorist label, I'm afraid, was pretty well earned, but it doesn't mean that organization does not do lots of other things, including being a very adept guerrilla warfare organization, and their attacks on Turkish security forces qualify in that respect, including being an organizer and sometimes an administrator of areas, including managing the diaspora, including engaging in the present political process. They're doing all of these things, but they also have a long record in terrorism. The only other point I'd make is there are ways to sort of earn one's way out of that label, if that's really, that's the way I could directly answer your question. We have one before us. It was only in October that People's Mujahideen al-Khalq was taken off the U.S. State Department list. There's a long, complicated series of reasons for that, including effective lobbying by them, but it also had to do with setting aside certain kinds of tactics for which they were famous in the 1980s. And their violence pattern from the 70s and 80s is very clear, but they're now effectively involved in lobbying and political activity. And so the change in character of the organization then is why Hillary Clinton ticked the box at the Department of State that removed them from that list. And that's another, it's a fairly cheery story of a group which I studied a lot and which made a gradual transformation over time.